First of all, thank you to the folks at Dovetail for organizing this wonderful event. Very glad that you invited us, and thank you for having us all. It does feel like it's been a couple of years for me. So if I'm a bit rusty, go easy. We'll warm up to it. I'll be talking about delightful products in the anti-fragile way. To do that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Boris. I'm the co-founder and head of product design at ThinkMill. And ThinkMill is a consultancy that works on product design and product engineering. So the stuff I'll tell you about is born of experience and something that I actually do, well, most days this week. Delightful products. This is why most of us are here. This is what we strive for, I think. I use slightly dry language sometimes to describe something called good and compelling products. They're very similar, but I think if I give you a quick definition of what I mean by that, that might be useful. So good and compelling encompasses a whole lot of qualities in a software product. Easy and intuitive to use, looks and feels great, well-built, performant, fast, all those things. Accessible and inclusive, desirable. You get the idea. It's all the good things that go into software products. All of that can be wrapped up into a sort of a simpler, shorter statement that we use as a bit of a litmus test and a shorthand for that, which is, would you sell the thing you're working on as a designer, engineer, product person, whatever it is, to your family and friends without reservation, without a caveat that says, I would, but if only the developers built it the way I designed it, that sort of thing. So delightful products, good and compelling products. That's why we're here. Now, we're constantly surrounded by smart people, good tools, modern technology. So in theory, it should be relatively easy to do this in a reliable fashion, and yet it's not. Now, if we use this low-res owl as an example of a good and compelling product, I think we all know what delightful products look and feel like. In fact, I would say that probably our grandmas and grandpas know what they feel like because they probably have a phone in their pocket that's filled with delightful experiences. And because we're practitioners, we also know in broad strokes how that magic happens, where we start and how we go about it. But often, the end result doesn't quite match the intention that we set out to do, whether we're a designer, engineer, or a product person. And sometimes things just go off the cliff entirely. So why? Why, despite smart people, good tools, modern tech, is it hard to make good and compelling products reliably? Well, I'll posit two reasons for that. Two very closely related reasons. And the first, again, let's imagine that this owl is the end result of a good and compelling product. We know in our bones what that looks like. We know how to start it. But actually drawing that owl is actually really complicated, nuanced, and more than anything, a team activity that has a lot of interconnected pieces. There is a common fallacy, I would say, where we assume intentionally or unintentionally, that as long as each of these practice areas does their thing well, it'll all just work out in the end. Things will be fine, it'll work. But we've learned this lesson a few times, I think, that no matter how individually brilliant a group of people might be, they don't necessarily work together and as a team automatically. They should, they damn well deserve to, but they don't, fortunately. The second reason why it's hard to make good and compelling products is we often treat things outside of our domain or our practice area as somebody else's problem. And we don't do that intentionally. In fact, by the fact that we're all here, we clearly care deeply about all of these domains in these areas. This stuff is enforced often structurally, sometimes in our culture, in our processes, in the learning curve involved in participating in another practice. We often default to working in waterfall-y ways with hand-ups. Designers design, developers build the thing. There's a designer's Jira board, there's a developer's Jira board. Design happens in Figma, where engineers might fumble around with public links trying to figure out what's what. Development happens in code, where designers usually don't even have access to it. That stuff reinforces this idea that that stuff is somebody else's problem, even if I don't want it to be, because sometimes I don't even have access to the area where that problem lives. Okay. Is anybody familiar with Douglas Adams and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? One of my all-time favorite authors. roll back for a second. He tells a story in the third book about the most advanced cloaking device that exists in the universe. And the context here, and this is relevant, I promise, is that a spaceship has just landed in the middle of a busy cricket pitch with a game going on and a crowd in the audience, and absolutely nobody is reacting because this ship has the most advanced cloaking device in the universe. It goes like this. I think, said Ford, that there's an SEP over there. An SEP, he said, is something that we can't see or don't see, or our brain doesn't let us see because we think it's somebody else's problem. That's what SEP means, somebody else's problem. The brain just edits it out. It's like a blind spot. It relies on people's natural predisposition not to see anything they don't want to, weren't expecting, or can't explain. That I think is pretty on point with some of the costs that we pay while working in practice silos. So part of the challenge for any of the stuff that we do is how do we take somebody else's problem and make it a shared problem for a team? So to reliably make good and compelling products requires, I would put to you two things: supportive, trusting, in-sync teams across those domains we touched on, and some practical tools to help us turn somebody else's problem into a shared problem and help us actually solve them meaningfully. So I'm from ThinkMill, as I mentioned, and over the last, well, almost decade and sometime prior to that, we've been developing and refining kind of a set of methods or a process or a methodology, if you like, as we've been building the various websites, apps, and design systems out there that we call antifragile. That's the name. We call it antifragile because, and I've been instructed to say this quite carefully, it combines our collective love for methods and process, but specifically my love for puns. That's the agile. Antifragile, in simple terms, is just our principles, core practices, and a playbook for making good and compelling products. This is what I'll talk to you about today and show you some examples. So before I start, it's worth acknowledging that, like all things, this is a remix. We haven't invented new things. We're not reinventing the wheel at all here. We pulled some of the principles that I'll talk to you about from the very excellent No Handoff method by Shamsi Brin. The design engineering handbook from InVision was instrumental in framing how to think about that design engineering special overlappy place. And of course, the agile principle themselves. But it's also sitting on top of about 15 years of kind of lived experience from all of us in the team. My own creds, just to kind of introduce my background here. I started designing for the web back in 2003, which was still high school days for me. I've been shipping web apps with engineers since 2005. Co-founder and head of product design at ThinkMill since 2013, and I have the privilege kind of daily to actually lead a consultancy that cares deeply about this stuff and actually practices a lot. Like we have this problem constantly of how do we form teams, how do we do work that generate good and compelling results. So it's very on topic and very interesting to me. Okay, so I'll cover off these four aspects of this methodology. In the interest of time, I'll focus on these two because I could otherwise talk about this for hours and we have other wonderful talks to hear. So let's get into it. As I mentioned, Shamsi Brin in her No Handoff method outlined four key principles that we've pretty much adopted wholesale because they're great. And that the first one is that design is everyone's job. Not in a literal sense, but in the context of a set of practitioners who are building software. Actually, everybody needs to participate in the design process because every practice area has something meaningful to contribute to the design of user experience outcomes. User experience outcomes should be the shared vocabulary amongst the team. So we all have different concerns and practice areas and parts of that to worry about, but actually we all strive, both in vocabulary and as a goal, to produce meaningful, good, measurable user experience outcomes, at least when we're talking about delightful products. And the last one is really leaning into code as a shared source of truth, right? Which guides us to spend a lot more time in the browser rather than into in static design tools. Okay, let's get into the more practical side of core practices. So from principles to behaviors, over the years, we've actually found, if I just find my mouse over here 1 second. There we go. Sorry, folks, just bear with me for one moment. Something we've observed over and over again is that there are 4 key practices, and amongst the many that we actually do and participate in all the time, that have an outsized impact on the ability of a team to form, get in sync, and be healthy, and therefore increase their likelihood of producing good and compelling outcomes. And that's these 4. I'll talk about each of them in turn. What's interesting about them, I think it's worth pointing it out, is that these all happen in the common spaces between our practices. So they happen in Zoom, in Slack, in Confluence, in a browser, as opposed to the domain-specific areas like Figma or GitHub. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that this makes them very accessible, very easy to pick up and start working in a cross-functional team. Okay, let's start with the big one. Co-design partnership. This is initially a mindset and a framing for a team, which then plays out in terms of behaviors and practices down the track. But it starts off by saying to the team, hey, you're all on a journey together. And the journey is one of creating shared understanding about the domain that you're going into and ultimately designing software for. This helps us avoid running too far ahead, because in a partnership, design decisions and the various and many trade-offs that we make need to be negotiated and agreed, as opposed to handed down from whichever practice happens to be leading the project. We also value highly the very different concerns that the different practice areas bring to the table. And the goal in a partnership is to integrate those and reconcile them rather than to ignore them. Second one is called gap finding and filling. Now, many of you might have heard of gap analysis or indeed participated in that. It's a wonderful practice. All we've done here in our conception of it is turn into a habit, a thing that happens in real time, as opposed to a thing that happens sometimes in a meeting. And the practical example here is to constantly be comparing and evaluating our design artifacts for interfaces and user experience against our artifacts for APIs or backend, trying to find and tease out those gaps for what might fall through and make each other work. In a practical sense, we sometimes keep what we call a gaps table, which can just be a table in Confluence or Notion or whatever format it wants to take, as a way of recording those gaps and then having meaningful conversations around how to make the trade-offs between the various competing concerns that are born when a gap exists. The third one is designing in the browser. Many things are either impossible or at least impractical to actually design in a static design tool like Figma. There's nothing wrong with Figma, nothing wrong with static design tools. We just need to acknowledge their limitations. Think, for example, the various aspects of accessibility. Think about conditional data logic, or just any kind of conditional logic itself. Static design tools are important, but they have a very specific place and a specific role to play. It does not produce complete designs in any way, shape, or form when we're talking about software as the intended target. I realize that Figma runs in a browser. That's not the kind of design in the browser that I mean. However, when we're designing software, by definition, the source of truth is in code. So we aim to express the designs that we're producing in code as soon as possible, to deploy that code and make it accessible. Talking about preview URLs, preview deployments, test flight, these kinds of things that actually allow those who are outside of the code environment to actually participate, pay attention, evaluate, and make design decisions as we go. When we do that, that is when we actually work in the browser, we're actually forced and confronted in a useful way to actually complete the design process. So if you design something in Figma, unless you also verbosely spec out the accessibility aspects of it, that is a gap that an engineer or a specialist needs to catch and fill at implementation time. Whereas if we're looking at the thing we're building in real time while we're building it, those things are both educational and useful and time saving. It's a good thing to do. This one actually means quite literally. We call it narrate your whip. And this actually means, like, in Slack, use the video recording tool. Use Loom, something like that. The actual practice is one of having just designed or implemented a thing, some work in progress, record yourself narrating it, talking through it as if you're doing a mini talk to an audience. It's a wonderful way to flush out gaps, flush out dead ends, things that you might not have thought of. Just the simple act of having to actually kind of account verbally for your work catches a lot of stuff that otherwise gets just passed down the line to somebody else. So really good practice. And because it's video, because it's async, it's a really efficient way to convey context and progress to stakeholders that might not be part of the day-to-day running of the team and the operation. Those are the 4 kind of core practices. Let's talk a little bit about how we think about forming teams in this way. So the anti-fragile team, there's a few different parts that we can talk about here, but it all starts with a core solution squad. Could be made up of these or similar people. The key, I think, here is to have some combination of product owner, UX lead, and tech lead as a sort of at least 3 legs of that stool. If you've got a design engineer, include them as well. They're a wonderful time-saving device. This group, when it's formed, has very explicit ownership and accountability for actually delivering the good and compelling outcome. So it's not the job of a scrum master or some business stakeholder, it's the working group that has that responsibility, which is why we have that litmus test question in the first place. Over time, they do that. They build shared context, shared understanding. They express it through shared artifacts, as you'll see in a minute. Then we have the delivery team. These are the people that join this team and actually help us do the work, deliver the code, ship the applications. Depending on the shape and size of the project, you might have more circles down the bottom or different circles. Sometimes they're the same people with multiple hats. And the thing that joins these 2 things together are shared artifacts, or more accurately, artifacts that capture and convey shared understanding, kind of a nuanced distinction there. The examples of this include things like a data model or a schema or a mock KPI or an activity map. Things that capture shared understanding. So let's take an example of a data model. It informs and enables the UX design process because it gives us the objects, the elements, the concepts that are required to do meaningful UX work, as much as it informs and shapes the actual implementation of the database or the design of the database. Another example is a mock API. That's a contract between the front end and the back end that actually enables both of those work areas to continue independently, knowing that they've got a common thing that they share. In addition to the structural things, there are some more fuzzy, harder to concisely convey in this setting kind of team principles that tie back to some of the original principles around this is a journey. We say to a team that gets together like this is a journey. You're on a journey. It's not a race. It's more of a marathon, not a sprint, more of a marathon. Stay in sync. Try not to actually get too far ahead because that stretches our ability to have and maintain shared understanding and shared context and work in the open. This is a tough one sometimes to actually overcome because personalities and habits come into play. Some people really like to just go and squirrel away and do the work and kind of bring it back fully formed. This team says work in the open. It's okay if it takes longer to do a bit because you recoup all that time down the track when you try and actually ship. Then finally, there's the playbook. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this. I'll keep it brief because the playbook in our context here is simply a library of practical know-how that we accumulate over time as we actually do things. We acquire it, so we end up with a whole collection of tools, techniques, methods for actually doing the work of design engineering. The interesting thing to note is that we group it by the sort of general life cycle. We've got product strategy, product definition, delivery. And as you see with some of these actual plays or activities or tools, they're definitely not meant to be, and they aren't written to be, prescriptive. It's not a paint by numbers instruction manual. We actually aim to fill these with examples and references of work that we've done in the past. You assume that the people that are working on a project are professionals, they have experience, they're competent, they're engaged, they care. But what's really useful when a new team is doing something new is to actually see what another team that did that, how they went about it. So this is more like a collection of case studies of the various ways that we do the work of design and engineering in particular. Okay, that's a nice story. Seems neat and concise. Does this actually work in the real world? was going to do like 3 case studies, and then I realized that I only have a limited amount of time. So I'll just show you one. Quick case study of a complex fintech product that I can't officially name, but it's complex and it's fun. And the useful context to keep in mind here is that as we came into it, we were forming a brand new team that hadn't worked together. And this was a mix of both thinkable and non-thinkable team members. Complex app, high level of subject matter expertise, kind of went pretty deep. There was an existing, mature, you could call it legacy backend. There's a new GraphQL API that needed to be designed and built through this process. And there was an existing and mature design system available to us. So how do we go about it? Well, we followed the little flower team principle. We formed the team, gave them, as we said, the clear ownership and responsibility for success. And we specifically gave them the space and time and resources to go on that journey together. These are the people that were involved. And as you see, some appeared twice. That's not a problem. That's a feature, not a bug. It's okay if in a small group setting, people wear multiple hats. It's actually more efficient because there's less transmission required. So as we go from here, let's play some anti-fragile bingo and see if we can kind of identify these various bits of tools that come into play. So in setting this team up, we definitely established the co-design partnership because that's very much at the heart of it. And we made design everybody's job because again, that's part of forming this team. And of course, we established a shared vocabulary and goals framed as positive and valuable user experiences for this particular product. The core solutions team then collaborated on, I hit play on that. We started by expressing a lot of our initial thoughts as UX wireframes. Now, it's worth noting, there's nothing special about these UX wireframes or this activity in our playbook. It's just like any other. It's just that at this stage of a project, this is a really useful place to start. We had some ideas. We had some prior art from previous versions of the product. We had a backend that was kind of close enough in shape. So we're able to productively get in and actually just bash out some visuals as a starting point. So UX wireframes, tick. That's one of the ones from our playbook. Then the team, the same team, that same core group, started working out a mock API. At the same time as trying to actually describe the UX flows in the journey, started mapping out how do we actually get that stuff from our servers and our database via our API to the client to render all that stuff. It's very valuable. This, as you can see, is the co-design partnership very much in full flight. In a very literal sense, this is you had a lead designer, a lead engineer and architect, product person working out Swagger docs. That was a bit counterintuitive. It took a little bit of selling to actually do together, but it was immensely valuable. And if you're following along, we're now doing gap analysis, gap filling and finding, because that's literally the outcome of that. Every time we draw something in the UX, we check it against our API spec. We're going to need a new API endpoint for that, and vice versa. It was a ball bouncing back and forth between the two things. Let's keep going. The joys of working on client projects. You got to censor stuff. The relevant thing to say here is that the UX work and that mock API actually enabled us to start building. We had a design system that was available to us, so we got straight into UI prototyping. Because we moved to the browser early, that actually allowed not just that core team, but the broader team to actually engage with the design process. Again, that point about more complete design. It's more than just the interface. It's more than even just the user journey. It's all the parts of it that actually go into the usability of this product. So we got another ding ding. We're designing in the browser. That's great. And of course, this means we're actually using code as a shared source of truth, again, in a very literal way. Prototyping UI with that mock API server in place surfaced a whole bunch of next layer of gaps. So missing functionality in the backend, really expensive queries that we didn't know were expensive until we tried to actually run them. Really amazing looking interactions and interfaces in Figma that once implemented, still nice, but they didn't add any value. They were just noise into the system. All of that stuff becomes visible by getting into the browser as quickly as we can. And interestingly, there's no audio in this one, but if there was, one of our chaps called Ben was doing a lot of narrating as he was going, talking about all the stuff he was implementing, and just sort of go, oh, this feels a bit weird. This drag and drop thing here doesn't need to be here. It doesn't add any value, right? So another part of our bingo, we're narrating our WIP as we go. Finally, having that stuff readily and quickly prototyped and available in high fidelity in the browser actually enabled a whole lot of very rapid, very quick, very cheap user testing and user validation as we went. It yielded a whole lot of useful insights that both gave us confidence on the stuff that we're getting right and quite dispassionately pointed out the stuff that we weren't getting right. And because of that, we were able to just confidently rip things out and change them because we knew that it wasn't a big setback to do that. It was actually an incorporation of a whole lot of learning that we're getting back from our users and subject matter experts. So that completes our bingo. That's our one-on-one UI research. Okay, so how do we stack up in that ultimate question? Does this pass the test of, would I sell this to my family and friends with that reservation? And we asked the team this question. And the answer was, well, it's not built yet. It's not shipped yet. It's a work in progress, but yeah, we're solidly on track. The point is, there's a huge amount of broad confidence that what we are doing is leading to a good and compelling outcome, even though we're still partway through. What about the team? That's good for the product. What about the team? Well, there are some useful and very valuable benefits that working in this way produces both for the team as well as the product. And that is, and remember, this is a team that hadn't worked together at all before, across two companies with two very different cultures, ended up getting in sync, built a whole lot of trust, got a bunch of velocity going. This is an important one. Felt heard and understood, which is a big fissure in our practice silos. Reported liking coming into work. I think they mean that in a virtual sense, but I think it's an important one. And of course, that sort of all says that they achieved a sense of flow, which if you've shipped many products, you know how valuable and important that is to actually creating good and compelling products. Okay, I will wrap up. I talked a bit about antifragile, which is merely a set of principles and practices to help teams get in sync, build trust, become supportive. It's also a playbook of very practical techniques to help them create good and compelling products. It specifically helps overcome the somebody else's problem, but also it ain't magical. It's not particularly revolutionary. It's a recipe for getting some of the obvious ass sounding basic things right, because actually the basics go a really long way. If you're keen to try this sort of stuff, the place to do that is by trying to form a team in this way with some of these principles. And of course, have a go at picking up some of these core practices. We found them to be very accessible, very easy. Takes a little bit of time to kind of get into the swing of things, but they're very readily available. Finally, I am going to publish all of this really soon. I was hoping to do that before this talk, but hopefully by the time the recording is published, it'll be online. If you want to get that and be aware of that, you can follow me on Twitter or the ThinkMill. We'll post the link and announcement for that. And for now, thank you very much for listening and having me here.
Thank you very much. That was a great talk. Does anyone have any questions for Boris that they want to raise? Oh, we got Brad in the back, making it really hard to get the microphone, but all right, we'll go there.
Hey, really good talk. Just one question. Was there like a fifth principle or value that kind of didn't make the cut, but you think is also important?
Ooh. Should there be? Honestly, those covered it pretty well. I've been thinking about those principles in various ways for a while. And when I read the no handoff method, just the succinct encapsulation of those four things, it's framed slightly differently. The idea of like, oh, we should just work in HTML and CSS prototypes, which is great. It doesn't really work when you're doing complex things. So expanding that into more of like a really just get your engineering team to publish the stuff that they're building on early and make it very visible and accessible, sort of a version of that same sort of thing. But it's pretty concise, I honestly think.
Cool. Are there any other questions for Boris? Anton, the back.
I really like your someone else problem and the way you're fighting that, but sometimes it's actually someone else problem. Microservices, teams, all that big corporations. So any advice?
Don't take it literally, right? You still have, one of the tricky things in talking about this is, yeah, don't take it too far. There are still people who design things and they're designers, and there are still engineers who engineer things. We don't all need to do the same thing, and we shouldn't and we can't. So this is more about at the sort of collective approach level. Just care about other people's problems. You don't need to solve them, but everyone should be interested in how do those microservices impact our ability to stitch together good user experiences? And the answer might be not much. That's okay, but your data model sure as hell does. So you should care about that. So it's more about saying, hey, like, be inquisitive, be curious, step outside your domain, because actually that's where a lot of the kind of magic happens when you're trying to build good things. Thank you for the question.
Cool. Any other questions for Boris? You got one at the back there.
I really like the principles. Just when you wrote what about the team, like we always try to in sync, but like there are situations where people are not aligned and there are conflicting situations. How do you manage that? That's the key, because when you are forming a team which didn't work previously together, that's the key aspect of how you onboard everyone on that particular aspect, because number of different people, number of different opinions. Thank you.
Absolutely. I could give a whole talk about just trying to get that team shape to actually happen and become sticky and take hold. The honest answer is there's not really much of a shortcut. Like a lot of things that require some amount of change, you need a couple of really enthusiastic champions that drive it, right? Sometimes you have to drag people kicking and screaming into this, like, work in the open, let's all work together, don't squirrel away kind of thing. Sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes you don't succeed, but actually trying is really important. And it does, you end up finding and attracting the people that are more suited to that kind of collective way of working just by trying to form teams like that. So kind of persist would be my my overall advice.
All right, let's give it up for Boris. Thank you so much.